What drives ordinary people to abandon everything they know and follow charismatic leaders into darkness? If you're fascinated by the psychology behind history's most notorious cults and want to understand how manipulation, control, and tragedy unfold in real time, you've found the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're about to dive deep into stories that will challenge everything you think you know about human nature, religious freedom, and the dangerous power of blind faith. I'm Boring Nightmares, and this is where we explore the twisted minds and devastating consequences of the world's deadliest cults. Let's begin. Throughout history, humanity has been drawn to charismatic leaders promising salvation, enlightenment, or escape from the mundane realities of existence. But sometimes, this search for meaning leads people down paths so dark and twisted that the very word cult sends chills down our spines. Today, we're diving deep into three of the most notorious and deadly cults that ever existed: the Branch Davidians, Heaven's Gate, and the Source family. These aren't just stories of misguided faith. These are tales of psychological manipulation, absolute control, and tragic endings that shocked the world and changed how we understand the dangerous power of extremist religious movements. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about religious freedom, government intervention, and the lengths people will go to follow their beliefs. These cults didn't just fade away quietly. They exploded into public consciousness through violence, mass suicide, and controversy that still sparks heated debates decades later. From the flames of Waco to the poisoned bodies in a California mansion, from Hollywood's health food revolution to apocalyptic prophecies, these three groups represent some of the most extreme examples of how spiritual seeking can transform into something truly deadly. But here's what makes these stories even more disturbing. None of these groups started as death cults. They began with seemingly noble ideals: spiritual growth, community, love, health, preparation for a better world. So how did they spiral into tragedy? What psychological mechanisms allowed charismatic leaders to convince hundreds of people to abandon their families, their possessions, and ultimately their lives? And perhaps most importantly, what warning signs did society miss that might have prevented these disasters? The Branch Davidians emerged from what seemed like a typical Christian Reformation movement. In 1929, Victor Houteff, a Bulgarian immigrant living in America, became convinced that the Seventh-day Adventist Church had lost its way. He published a series of religious tracts called Shepherd's Rod, calling for reform within the church and emphasizing the imminent return of Jesus Christ. This wasn't unusual. Throughout Christian history, reform movements have emerged whenever believers felt their churches had become too comfortable or strayed from core teachings. Houteff's message resonated with followers who shared his conviction that mainstream Adventists had become complacent about Christ's second coming. In 1935, he led his growing group of believers to establish a settlement near Waco, Texas, where they could live simply and prepare for the end times. They called their community Mount Carmel, and for decades, it functioned as a relatively peaceful religious commune focused on Bible study, simple living, and apocalyptic preparation. After Houteff's death in 1955, the group experienced the kind of leadership struggles that plague many religious movements when their founder dies. Various individuals claimed authority, leading to schisms and competing factions. Ben Roden emerged as a leader in 1959, forming what became known as the Branch Davidians, a name that emphasized their connection to biblical prophecy about the branch of David mentioned in the Old Testament. For nearly 3 decades, the Branch Davidians remained a relatively obscure religious sect. They maintained their compound, studied their interpretation of biblical prophecy, and largely kept to themselves. Most Americans had never heard of them, and they posed no apparent threat to anyone. But all of that changed in the mid-1980s when a charismatic young man named Vernon Howell arrived at Mount Carmel and began his calculated rise to absolute power. Howell was born in Houston in 1959 to a teenage mother and grew up in a troubled household marked by poverty and instability. As a young man, he became deeply interested in biblical prophecy and joined the Branch Davidians in 1981. What happened next reveals the classic pattern of how dangerous cult leaders emerge. Howell didn't immediately declare himself a prophet or demand absolute authority. Instead, he carefully studied the group's beliefs, identified the existing power structures, and positioned himself as someone with special spiritual insights. The power struggle that followed Howell's arrival was both bizarre and brutal. He became involved in a complex relationship with Lois Roden, the elderly widow of former leader Ben Roden, claiming that God had commanded them to have a child together. This relationship gave him legitimacy within the group's hierarchy, but it also created enemies, particularly George Roden, Lois's son, who expected to inherit leadership of the Branch Davidians. The conflict between Howell and George Roden escalated dramatically throughout the 1980s. At one point, Roden dug up a corpse and challenged Howell to raise it from the dead to prove who had divine authority. Howell responded by gathering armed followers and attempting to citizens arrest Roden for corpse abuse. The resulting shootout in 1987 led to Howell's trial for attempted murder, though he was ultimately acquitted. By 1990, Howell had successfully ousted his rivals and gained complete control of the Branch Davidians. It was then that he made an announcement that should have served as a massive warning sign to anyone paying attention. He legally changed his name to David Koresh, claiming that David connected him to the biblical King David, and Koresh was the Hebrew name for Cyrus, the Persian king mentioned in biblical prophecy. More disturbing, he began teaching that he was the Lamb mentioned in the book of Revelation, a figure traditionally identified with Jesus Christ. Under Koresh's leadership, the Branch Davidians underwent a radical transformation that illustrates how quickly religious groups can shift from conventional to dangerous. Koresh implemented what he called the New Light doctrine, a series of revelations that conveniently gave him absolute authority over every aspect of his followers' lives. He declared that all marriages within the group were dissolved and that only he had the right to procreate. All other men were required to remain celibate, while Koresh took multiple spiritual wives, including girls as young as 11 years old. This wasn't just about sexual control, though that was certainly a major component. Koresh was systematically breaking down the normal social bonds that might allow people to resist his authority. By separating married couples, controlling reproduction, and positioning himself as the exclusive conduit to God, he created a social structure where questioning his commands became literally unthinkable for his followers. The transformation of Mount Carmel under Koresh's leadership reveals how dangerous cults operate. The compound became increasingly isolated from the outside world. Koresh controlled all information coming in and going out. He subjected followers to marathon Bible study sessions that could last for 12 hours or more, using sleep deprivation and information overload as tools of psychological control. He taught that the outside world was corrupt and that government authorities were agents of Satan who would eventually try to destroy the faithful. Perhaps most ominously, Koresh began preparing his followers for what he called the approaching apocalypse. He taught that the American government was the lamb-like beast mentioned in Revelation, and that federal agents would eventually come to Mount Carmel to persecute the faithful. This wasn't just theological speculation. Koresh began stockpiling weapons and ammunition, ostensibly for the coming battle between good and evil, but actually creating the conditions that would make that battle inevitable. The Branch Davidians under Koresh accumulated a massive arsenal that included hundreds of firearms, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and materials that could be used to manufacture explosives. They established a business called the Mag Bag, which sold ammunition and gun accessories at gun shows throughout Texas. This provided both income for the group and a cover story for their weapons purchases, but it also attracted the attention of federal authorities. By 1992, multiple government agencies were investigating the Branch Davidians. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms suspected them of illegally converting semi-automatic weapons to full automatic capability. Child Protective Services had received reports of child abuse, including allegations that Koresh was sexually abusing minors he claimed as spiritual wives. The Internal Revenue Service was investigating their tax-exempt status given their commercial gun business. What makes the Branch Davidian story so tragic is that there were numerous opportunities for intervention before the situation spiraled into violence. Former members had reported Koresh's abusive behavior to authorities. Social workers had visited the compound and documented concerning conditions. Law enforcement agencies were well aware of the group's weapons stockpiling and Koresh's apocalyptic teachings. Yet somehow, the response that emerged was almost perfectly designed to fulfill Koresh's prophecies about government persecution. The decision to use military-style tactics against a group that expected military-style persecution reveals a catastrophic failure to understand the psychological dynamics at play. Koresh had spent years teaching his followers that government agents were servants of Satan who would eventually come to Mount Carmel with weapons and violence. When that's exactly what happened on February 28, 1993, it didn't discredit Koresh's teachings. It validated them completely. The initial raid by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was supposed to be a surprise operation that would quickly secure the compound and arrest Koresh. Instead, it turned into a 2-hour gun battle that left 4 federal agents and 6 Branch Davidians dead. The element of surprise was lost when a television cameraman accidentally tipped off the group about the impending raid. When heavily armed federal agents approached Mount Carmel, Koresh's followers saw exactly what their leader had predicted: the forces of evil coming to destroy the faithful. What followed was 51 days of siege that became a media spectacle watched by millions around the world. The FBI brought in nearly 900 law enforcement officers, including hostage negotiators, tactical teams, and psychological warfare specialists. They cut off electricity and water to the compound, played loud music and sounds of animals being slaughtered to prevent sleep, and used bright lights to disorient the people inside. Each of these tactics, designed by experts to pressure the Branch Davidians into surrendering, actually reinforced Koresh's teachings about persecution and the approaching end times. The more pressure authorities applied, the more convinced his followers became that they were living through the prophetic events Koresh had been describing for years. They weren't just resisting arrest. In their minds, they were fulfilling their cosmic destiny as God's chosen people under attack by Satan's agents. During the siege, Koresh engaged in long telephone conversations with FBI negotiators, but these talks revealed the fundamental disconnect between law enforcement's goals and the Branch Davidians' worldview. Negotiators wanted Koresh to surrender and face trial in the normal legal system. Koresh wanted to complete his interpretation of the seven seals from the Book of Revelation, which he claimed would reveal God's plan for the end of the world. These weren't positions that could be negotiated or compromised. The tragic end came on April 19, 1993, when FBI agents decided to end the siege by pumping tear gas into the compound to force the Branch Davidians out. The plan was based on the assumption that when faced with unbearable conditions, parents would prioritize their children's safety and surrender. Instead, fires broke out inside Mount Carmel, and the entire compound was engulfed in flames within hours. 76 people died in the fire, including 25 children and David Koresh himself. Only 9 people escaped the burning compound. Investigations later revealed that many of the dead had been shot, apparently by other Branch Davidians, suggesting that some members chose to kill their families and themselves rather than surrender to authorities they believed were agents of Satan. The Waco siege remains one of the most controversial law enforcement operations in American history because it raises fundamental questions about religious freedom, government power, and the appropriate response to extremist groups. Critics argue that federal agents created the very confrontation they claimed to be trying to prevent. Supporters contend that Koresh's illegal weapons stockpiling and child abuse made intervention necessary, regardless of the tragic outcome. But perhaps the most important lesson from Waco is how perfectly it illustrates the self-fulfilling nature of apocalyptic prophecy. Koresh taught his followers that government agents would come with weapons to destroy them, and that's exactly what happened. He predicted that the faithful would face a final test requiring them to choose between surrender to evil forces or death in service to God, and that's the choice his followers ultimately faced. He promised that their sacrifice would be vindicated in the coming kingdom of God, and his surviving followers still believe that vindication is coming. The Branch Davidian tragedy demonstrates how dangerous cults can emerge from seemingly normal religious movements when charismatic leaders gain absolute control over their followers' lives and beliefs. It shows how isolation, information control, and apocalyptic teachings can create psychological conditions where mass death becomes not just acceptable, but desirable. Now that we've examined the devastating collapse of the Branch Davidians, we turn our attention to another cult that would meet an equally tragic end, but through an entirely different lens of manipulation and control. Heaven's Gate represents one of the most chilling examples of how science fiction beliefs combined with masterful psychological manipulation, can lead ordinary people to willingly surrender their lives in pursuit of an impossible dream. The story begins in 1972 when two unlikely individuals crossed paths in what would become one of the most bizarre partnerships in cult history. Marshall Applewhite, a former music professor struggling with his sexuality and mental health, met Bonnie Nettles, a nurse and astrology enthusiast, while both were patients at a psychiatric hospital. This meeting would spawn a movement that blended Christian apocalypticism with UFO mythology in ways that seemed almost absurd, yet proved devastatingly effective at controlling human minds. What made their initial partnership so dangerous was how perfectly their personalities complemented each other's weaknesses. Applewhite brought intellectual credibility and charismatic speaking ability, while Nettles provided spiritual authority and mystical interpretation. They convinced themselves and eventually hundreds of others that they were the two witnesses prophesied in the book of Revelation, destined to be killed and resurrected before ascending to heaven. But their version of heaven wasn't the traditional Christian paradise. Instead, they preached about an extraterrestrial kingdom that could only be reached by abandoning everything human about themselves. The early days of their movement in the mid-1970s revealed the sophisticated recruitment techniques that would become their trademark. Unlike other cult leaders who relied primarily on fear or promise of earthly power, Applewhite and Nettles, who called themselves Bo and Peep, tapped into something deeper: humanity's fundamental loneliness and desire for transcendence. They targeted people who felt disconnected from society, often those involved in New Age spirituality, science fiction fandom, or individuals experiencing major life transitions. Their recruitment meetings were masterfully orchestrated psychological operations. Attendees expecting typical UFO lectures instead encountered a carefully crafted presentation that gradually introduced increasingly radical concepts. The meetings began with seemingly reasonable discussions about spiritual evolution and extraterrestrial life, then slowly progressed to claims that attendees could literally transform into alien beings. What made their approach so insidious was how they framed their extreme demands as scientific rather than religious. They didn't ask people to have faith in traditional religious concepts. Instead, they presented their beliefs as advanced knowledge about biological and spiritual evolution. They claimed that just as caterpillars transform into butterflies, humans could metamorphose into beings from what they called the next level, an extraterrestrial realm of existence that transcended physical death. The process of indoctrination was gradual and systematic. New recruits weren't immediately asked to abandon their families and possessions. Instead, they were invited to attend study groups where they learned about the supposed evolutionary process awaiting them. These sessions used a combination of Bible study, science fiction concepts, and guided meditation to slowly reshape participants' understanding of reality. Members were taught that their human bodies were merely temporary vehicles or containers for their true spiritual selves. As people became more deeply involved, the demands escalated in carefully calculated steps. First, they were asked to reduce contact with family and friends who didn't understand their spiritual journey. Then, they were encouraged to simplify their possessions and lifestyle. Eventually, They were invited to join the group full-time, surrendering all personal property and relationships in exchange for the promise of cosmic evolution. The group's nomadic lifestyle in the 1970s and early 1980s served multiple psychological functions. By constantly moving around the American Southwest, living in tents and temporary housing, members were kept physically uncomfortable and socially isolated. This made them increasingly dependent on the group for basic survival needs, while preventing them from establishing outside relationships that might challenge the group's teachings. During this period, Applewhite and Nettles refined their doctrine into an increasingly elaborate system of beliefs. They taught that Earth was essentially a garden maintained by extraterrestrial beings to cultivate souls capable of graduating to the next level. According to their teaching, most humans were not ready for this evolution, but a select few in each generation could achieve the necessary spiritual development to make the transition. The psychological brilliance of this doctrine was how it made members feel simultaneously special and desperate. They were told they were among the chosen few capable of evolutionary advancement, which appealed to their desire for significance and purpose. Simultaneously, they were taught that this opportunity was extremely rare and could be lost if they didn't fully commit to the process, creating constant anxiety about their spiritual progress. When Bonnie Nettles died of cancer in 1985, the movement faced its first major crisis. Her death directly contradicted their teaching that dedicated members would physically ascend to the next level without dying. Rather than abandoning their beliefs, Applewhite, now calling himself Dew, adapted the doctrine in ways that would prove catastrophic. He reinterpreted Nettles' death as evidence that she had successfully graduated to the next level ahead of the others, and that physical death might actually be necessary for the transition. This doctrinal shift marked the beginning of Heaven's Gate's final phase. Applewhite became increasingly obsessed with the idea that the human body was an obstacle to spiritual evolution. He began teaching that members needed to overcome all human desires and attachments, including the most basic biological drives. This led to increasingly extreme practices designed to suppress their humanity. The group's approach to sexuality became particularly disturbing during this period. Applewhite taught that sexual desire was one of the primary barriers to spiritual advancement. He convinced several male members, including himself, to undergo castration as the ultimate demonstration of their commitment to overcoming human nature. These surgical procedures were performed by a group member who was a former nurse, often without proper medical supervision or aftercare. The psychological manipulation required to convince people to undergo voluntary castration reveals the depth of control Applewhite had achieved over his followers. He presented the procedure not as mutilation, but as liberation from the biological prison of human sexuality. Members who underwent castration were praised as the most advanced students, creating social pressure for others to consider the same extreme step. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, the group lived in increasing isolation, moving between rented houses and maintaining minimal contact with the outside world. They supported themselves through various schemes, including computer consulting work and operating a web design business they called Higher Source. The irony of using cutting-edge technology to spread their anti-human message wasn't lost on observers, but it demonstrated their ability to adapt modern tools to serve their apocalyptic agenda. During this period, Applewhite's mental state appeared to deteriorate significantly. Former members who left during the 1990s described him as becoming increasingly paranoid and erratic. He became convinced that government agencies were monitoring the group and that traditional religious organizations were actively working to prevent people from hearing their message. This paranoia further isolated the group and reinforced their belief that they were engaged in a cosmic battle between good and evil. The group's final chapter began with the appearance of the Hale-Bopp comet in 1996. Comets had always held special significance in their mythology, but Hale-Bopp seemed to offer the cosmic sign they had been waiting for. When amateur astronomers reported anomalous objects near the comet, Applewhite seized on these reports as evidence that an extraterrestrial spacecraft was approaching Earth. In October 1996, using money from their web design business and members' life insurance policies, the group rented a luxurious mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, an exclusive suburb of San Diego. The choice of location was significant. After decades of austere living conditions, they suddenly surrounded themselves with luxury for their final months. The mansion represented their belief that they were preparing for graduation to a higher level of existence. The final months of Heaven's Gate revealed the culmination of over 2 decades of psychological conditioning. Members spent their time creating farewell videos, maintaining their website, and preparing for what they believed would be their transformation into extraterrestrial beings. These videos provide haunting insight into the complete mental control Applewhite had achieved. Members spoke with genuine excitement about abandoning their human bodies, describing their upcoming deaths as a long-awaited liberation. On March 26, 1997, all 39 remaining members of Heaven's Gate participated in what they called their graduation ceremony. The methodical nature of their mass suicide revealed the group's obsession with order and control even in death. Members were divided into 3 groups, with each group helping the previous one die before taking their own lives. They consumed a lethal mixture of phenobarbital mixed with applesauce and vodka, then placed plastic bags over their heads to ensure death by asphyxiation. The scene discovered by police was unlike anything in the history of cult suicides. All 39 bodies were found lying peacefully on beds and couches, dressed in identical black outfits and new Nike sneakers. Each person had a $5 bill and quarters in their pockets, supposedly for the journey ahead. Purple shrouds covered their faces, and packed bags sat beside each body, emphasizing their belief that they were departing on a cosmic voyage. The Heaven's Gate tragedy demonstrates how seemingly ridiculous beliefs can become deadly when combined with sophisticated psychological manipulation and social isolation. Unlike other cult leaders who used violence or coercion to maintain control, Applewhite achieved something far more disturbing. He convinced his followers to eagerly embrace their own destruction. The farewell videos show people who genuinely believed they were making the greatest decision of their lives, revealing the complete transformation of their perception of reality. The impact of Heaven's Gate extended far beyond the 39 lives lost in that San Diego mansion. The tragedy exposed how vulnerable people can become when their basic psychological needs for meaning, belonging, and purpose are exploited by charismatic manipulators. It revealed how modern technology and scientific language can be weaponized to make even the most outlandish beliefs seem credible to desperate individuals seeking answers to life's fundamental questions. Perhaps most chilling was the realization that the victims weren't obviously mentally ill or exceptionally gullible people. Many had college educations, successful careers, and loving families. What they shared was a sense of alienation from conventional society and a yearning for something greater than ordinary human existence. Applewhite's genius lay in recognizing these universal human desires and crafting a belief system that promised to fulfill them while systematically destroying his followers' ability to think critically about their situation. The Heaven's Gate website remained active for years after the suicides, maintained by surviving members who still believed in the group's teachings. Our third deadly cult takes us to the sun-soaked hills of 1970s Hollywood, where spiritual seeking and counterculture collided in one of the most fascinating and deceptive communes in American history. The Source family wasn't your typical religious movement. It emerged from the glamorous world of celebrity dining and health food trends, created by a man whose past was as colorful as it was dangerous. James Edward Baker seemed to live multiple lives before becoming the spiritual leader known as Father Yod. Born in 1922, Baker was a decorated World War II Marine who had seen combat in the Pacific Theater. After the war, he became a successful restaurateur and Hollywood socialite, but his background held darker secrets. Baker was a judo expert who had reportedly killed a man in self-defense during a street altercation. Even more shocking, he had allegedly been involved in bank robberies and had registered his hands as lethal weapons with local authorities. This wasn't a man you'd expect to find leading meditation sessions and preaching about love and natural living. But Baker's transformation began in the late 1960s when he started studying various spiritual traditions. He worked with Yogi Bhajan, learning Kundalini yoga practices, and became influenced by the Nature Boys movement and esoteric teachings that were popular in California's alternative spiritual scene. By 1971, he had reinvented himself completely, declaring himself the father of the approaching age of Aquarius, and adopting the mystical names Father Yod and later Yahuwah. The financial foundation for his spiritual empire came through The Source, a pioneering health food restaurant he opened in 1969 on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles. This wasn't just any restaurant. The Source quickly became the hottest spot for Hollywood's elite, serving organic vegetarian cuisine to celebrities like John Lennon, Steve McQueen, Warren Beatty, Marlon Brando, and countless other A-listers. The restaurant was grossing up to $10,000 a day at its peak, an enormous sum for the early 1970s, and this success provided Father Yod with the resources to build his commune. Life in the commune appeared idyllic to outsiders, and even to many members. People moved through the mansion in flowing robes, or sometimes completely nude, embracing what they called a metaphysical life, and studying their supposed past incarnations under Father Yod's guidance. The commune became known for its radical ideas about free love, natural foods, and communal living. Father Yod's teachings were an eclectic and carefully crafted mix of Western esotericism, Kundalini yoga principles borrowed from Yogi Bhajan, astrological concepts about the age of Aquarius, and teachings from esoteric figures like Manly P. Hall. He bestowed each member with a new first name, and they all adopted Aquarian as their middle and last names, signifying their collective identity and connection to what they believed was the dawning age of Aquarius. This renaming process was one of the first steps in breaking down individual identity and creating total dependence on the group. The Source family embraced natural childbirth, and many women in the mother house were frequently pregnant or breastfeeding, reflecting their focus on what they called a natural lifestyle. Father Yud preached love, kindness, and healthy living, but he also introduced practices that included smoking what he called the sacred herb, marijuana, and established a complex system of what he termed familial love that extended to sexual relationships within the commune. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful spiritual community lay a much darker reality. Father Yod's leadership was characterized by an absolute patriarchal structure, despite some members describing it as a benevolent dictator dynamic. He took multiple spiritual wives, eventually having 14, and there were serious allegations and concerns about underage women being encouraged to marry into the family. These young women were sometimes paired with much older men, reportedly to prevent legal intervention by their worried parents who were trying to extract their daughters from the commune. The manipulation extended beyond sexual control. While Father Yod maintained a luxurious lifestyle, being chauffeured around Los Angeles in a white Rolls-Royce and living in opulence, other family members were required to pool all their finances and personal resources for the supposed benefit of the community. This economic control meant that members who wanted to leave often found themselves with no money, no possessions, and nowhere to go, making escape extremely difficult. Father Yod also established what became known as one of the most prolific psychedelic rock bands in history. Originally called Father Yod in the Spirit of 76, later renamed Yahowah 13, the band recorded over 60 albums in just 1973 and 1974. Their music was known for improvised, spontaneous music sessions that often lasted for hours, and while the quality was questionable, the sheer volume of their output was remarkable. These recording sessions served multiple purposes for Father Yod, providing another avenue for his creative control over the family and generating additional income streams. The family also had their own experimental approach to child rearing that raised serious concerns among former members and outside observers. Children born into the commune were considered communal property rather than belonging to their biological parents. Father Yod made decisions about their education, discipline, and even which adults they would live with. Former members later described how children were often separated from their birth mothers and assigned to other family members, creating confusion and emotional trauma that lasted well into their adult lives. The Source family's belief system included some genuinely dangerous elements disguised as spiritual practices. Father Yod claimed to have supernatural powers and convinced his followers that he could protect them from harm through his spiritual energy. He encouraged risky behaviors, telling members that their faith in him would keep them safe from physical danger. This reckless attitude toward safety would ultimately prove fatal, though not in the way anyone expected. The beginning of the end came when the Source family was effectively pushed out of Los Angeles by local authorities and concerned parents who were working to expose the group's practices. Father Yod decided to relocate the entire commune to Hawaii, where he believed they could establish a new compound away from outside interference. However, the move to Hawaii proved disastrous for the group's finances and cohesion. In Hawaii, without the steady income from the Source restaurant and removed from their Hollywood Hills mansion, the family struggled to maintain their lifestyle. Members were forced to live in much more primitive conditions, and the stress began to fracture the group's unity. Some members started questioning Father Yod's leadership and his increasingly erratic decisions. Father Yod's death came suddenly and tragically on August 25, 1975, at the age of 53, but it wasn't from the kind of mass suicide or violent confrontation that marked other deadly cults. Instead, it happened during what can only be described as a moment of incredible recklessness. Father Yod decided to try hang gliding for the first time, despite having no experience with the sport and ignoring all safety recommendations from more experienced pilots. On that August day in Hawaii, Father Yod launched himself off a cliff in a hang glider, crashed almost immediately, and suffered fatal injuries. Unlike other cult leaders who led their followers to mass death, Father Yod died alone, taking no one with him in his final act of dangerous impulsivity. However, what happened after his death revealed just how deeply the family had been conditioned to follow his unconventional teachings. The remaining family members sat with Father Yod's corpse for 3.5 days before contacting authorities, reflecting their unconventional views on death and what they claimed was a more natural approach to grieving. During this time, they conducted their own rituals and ceremonies, believing that his spirit was still present and communicating with them. When authorities finally arrived, they found a group of people who seemed completely detached from reality, still convinced that their leader possessed supernatural powers, even in death. After Father Yod's death, the Source family quickly disintegrated. Without their charismatic leader's control and manipulation, members began to see their situation more clearly. Many found themselves stranded in Hawaii with no money, no possessions, and no clear idea of how to rebuild their lives. Some former members later described the period after Father Yod's death as simultaneously liberating and terrifying, as they realized how completely they had surrendered their independence and decision-making abilities. The psychological damage inflicted by the Source family's practices became apparent in the years following its dissolution. Former members struggled with issues of identity, having lived for years under assumed names and suppressed personalities. Many had difficulty forming healthy relationships, having been conditioned to view all personal connections through the lens of Father Yod's teachings about familial love and spiritual hierarchy. Children who had grown up in the family faced particularly severe challenges. Many had received little formal education and possessed few practical skills for living in mainstream society. The communal child-rearing practices had left them confused about family relationships and personal boundaries. Some struggled with substance abuse and mental health issues that seemed directly connected to their experiences in the commune. Despite the tragic outcomes and obvious manipulation involved, the Source family is often viewed more sympathetically than other deadly cults, perhaps because Father Yod's death was accidental rather than a deliberate act of violence against his followers. Some former members and observers describe it as a significant social experiment in utopian living, pointing to the extensive archives of music, photography, and documentation that the family left behind. But this more generous interpretation misses the fundamental reality of what the source family represented. It was a system of control and exploitation disguised as spiritual enlightenment, where a dangerous and manipulative leader used the language of love and natural living to justify his domination over vulnerable people seeking meaning and community. The source family's story reveals how easily spiritual seeking can be weaponized by charismatic predators. Father Yod understood that people hungry for authentic spiritual experience and community were willing to surrender their judgment and independence in exchange for a sense of belonging and purpose. He created an environment where questioning his authority was treated as a spiritual failing, where financial exploitation was disguised as communal sharing, and where sexual abuse was reframed as sacred practice. The group's Hollywood connections and celebrity clientele at the Source restaurant provided a veneer of legitimacy that helped Father Yod recruit new members and deflect criticism. The association with famous musicians and actors made the family seem glamorous and spiritually advanced rather than dangerous. The psychological manipulation techniques employed by these three cults reveal a disturbing pattern of how ordinary people can be systematically broken down and rebuilt according to a leader's twisted vision. Each group developed sophisticated methods of control that went far beyond simple persuasion, creating psychological prisons that were often more effective than physical ones. The Branch Davidians under David Koresh perfected the art of biblical manipulation combined with sexual control. Koresh didn't just interpret scripture, he weaponized it, positioning himself as the Lamb of God while simultaneously claiming exclusive sexual rights to all women in the compound. His psychological dominance was built on creating a closed theological system where questioning his authority meant questioning God himself. Members were subjected to marathon Bible study sessions lasting up to 15 hours, during which Koresh would weave complex interpretations that always concluded with his divine authority. Sleep deprivation became a tool of control, as exhausted minds became more susceptible to his teachings. The sexual manipulation was particularly insidious. Koresh declared that all marriages within the compound were invalid except his own spiritual unions, effectively breaking apart existing family bonds and creating new loyalty structures centered entirely on him. Male members were forced into celibacy while watching their wives and daughters become Koresh's spiritual wives. This systematic humiliation served multiple purposes. It demonstrated his absolute power, eliminated potential rivals, and created a sense of learned helplessness among the men who might otherwise challenge his authority. Children born into the compound were subjected to brutal discipline and isolated from outside influences. Koresh created a generation of followers who knew no reality beyond his teachings, ensuring the perpetuation of his control. Former members described how children were beaten for minor infractions and taught to view the outside world as irredeemably evil, making escape psychologically impossible even when physically feasible. Heaven's Gate employed a different but equally devastating approach, using technological metaphors and gradual dehumanization to strip away individual identity. Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles brilliantly exploited the cultural moment of the 1970s, when both religious seeking and fascination with extraterrestrial life were at their peak. Their initial recruitment strategy was genius in its simplicity. They offered answers to people already searching for meaning, then gradually replaced their human connections with dependence on the group. The process of dehumanization was methodical and complete. Members were taught to view their bodies as mere containers or vehicles for their true spiritual essence. This wasn't just philosophical speculation, it had practical implications that made the eventual mass suicide psychologically acceptable. By convincing followers that their human attachments, desires, and even their physical forms were obstacles to spiritual evolution, Applewhite created a mindset where death became preferable to continued earthly existence. The group's obsession with androgyny and the voluntary castrations performed by several members, including Applewhite himself, represented the ultimate rejection of human nature. These weren't impulsive decisions, but the logical conclusion of years of conditioning that portrayed human sexuality and emotion as primitive evolutionary stages to be transcended. The regimented lifestyle, identical clothing, and shared living spaces all served to erase individual identity and replace it with group consciousness. What made Heaven's Gate particularly dangerous was how they used members' intelligence against them. Unlike some cults that discouraged education, Heaven's Gate attracted well-educated individuals and used their analytical abilities to create increasingly complex theological systems that seemed logical within the group's closed universe. Members spent hours studying and perfecting their understanding of the next level, creating an intellectual investment that made departure psychologically costly. The Source family represented perhaps the most seductive form of manipulation, disguising control with an apparent freedom and love. Father Yod's genius lay in creating an environment that felt liberating while being fundamentally authoritarian. The Hollywood setting, celebrity clientele, and countercultural aesthetics made the group appear progressive and enlightened rather than controlling and dangerous. The sexual dynamics within the Source family were particularly complex. While marketed as free love and spiritual exploration, the reality was a carefully structured system that served Father Yod's desires while maintaining the illusion of choice. His 14 spiritual wives weren't equal partners in a polyamorous arrangement, but rather a harem that demonstrated his power and virility. The practice of pairing young women with older male members served multiple functions. It prevented families from interfering with underage recruits, created loyalty through intimate bonds, and maintained the patriarch's control over reproduction and sexuality within the group. The economic structure of the Source family revealed another layer of manipulation. While Father Yod maintained his luxurious lifestyle, complete with a white Rolls-Royce and multiple homes, other members surrendered all personal possessions and income to the collective. This economic dependence made leaving practically impossible for most members, especially those with children. The successful restaurant provided a veneer of legitimacy while functioning as a recruitment tool and revenue stream for the leader's lifestyle. Father Yod's use of name changes and spiritual rebirth ceremonies served to sever members' connections to their previous identities and relationships. By becoming Aquarians with new spiritual names, followers symbolically died to their old selves and were reborn as extensions of Father Yod's will. This psychological technique, common among cults, makes it extremely difficult for members to maintain connections to outside support systems or remember who they were before joining the group. The music and creative activities within the Source family weren't expressions of artistic freedom, but rather tools of indoctrination. The improvised, trance-like musical sessions served to create altered states of consciousness that made members more susceptible to suggestion and less capable of critical thinking. The prolific recording output, over 60 albums in 2 years, kept members constantly engaged in group activities that reinforced collective identity while providing minimal time for individual reflection or doubt. What makes the Source family's story particularly tragic is how Father Yod's death revealed the hollowness of his promises. Unlike other cult leaders who led their followers into death, Father Yod died alone in a reckless hang-gliding accident, abandoning his spiritual children to figure out life without their supposed guide to enlightenment. The fact that members sat with his corpse for 3.5 days before contacting authorities demonstrates how completely they had been conditioned to exist outside normal social structures. The aftermath of Father Yod's death exposed the psychological damage inflicted on members. Many struggled with basic life skills, having surrendered decision-making authority to their leader for years. Former members reported difficulties with everything from financial management to forming healthy relationships, as they had been conditioned to suppress individual will in favor of group consciousness. These 3 groups demonstrate how cult manipulation exploits fundamental human needs for belonging, purpose, and transcendence. The leaders didn't create these needs. They simply identified vulnerable individuals experiencing them and offered counterfeit solutions that ultimately enslaved rather than fulfilled. Now let's examine the psychological mechanisms that allowed these 3 cults to maintain such devastating control over their followers. Understanding how ordinary people became trapped in these destructive systems reveals disturbing truths about human vulnerability and the sophisticated manipulation tactics employed by cult leaders. The power of isolation cannot be overstated in cult dynamics. The Branch Davidians lived in their remote compound near Waco, where David Koresh controlled all information flow. Members had limited contact with family and friends outside the group, making it nearly impossible to maintain perspective on what was happening inside. Heaven's Gate took this even further, moving their followers to isolated locations in the Southwest and later to the mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, where members lived under assumed identities and had virtually no contact with their former lives. The Source family, while based in Hollywood, created psychological isolation by demanding total devotion to Father Yod's teachings and making the commune the center of members' entire social universe. This isolation worked hand in hand with information control, another cornerstone of cult manipulation. Koresh positioned himself as the sole interpreter of biblical prophecy, claiming that only through him could followers understand God's true message. He spent hours delivering complex theological lectures that confused and overwhelmed his audience, making them dependent on his interpretations. Heaven's Gate created their own elaborate cosmology that mixed Christianity, New Age beliefs, and UFO mythology in ways that required constant explanation from the leadership. Members were discouraged from consuming outside media or maintaining relationships that might challenge these beliefs. The Source family similarly created an insular world of esoteric teachings that Father Yod claimed only he could properly transmit. The concept of thought stopping played a crucial role in all three groups. Cult experts identify this as the practice of engaging members in repetitive activities that prevent critical thinking. The Branch Davidians spent countless hours in Bible study sessions led by Koresh, often lasting through the night, leaving participants mentally exhausted and less capable of questioning what they heard. Heaven's Gate members engaged in rigid daily routines and repetitive chanting that occupied their minds and prevented them from reflecting on their situation. The Source family combined meditation practices with constant group activities and Father Yod's lengthy philosophical discourses that kept members mentally occupied and dependent on the group for intellectual stimulation. Economic control proved equally devastating across all three cults. Members were required to surrender their personal assets and financial independence, creating practical barriers to leaving even when doubts arose. Branch Davidian members turned over their paychecks, property, and possessions to the group, leaving them with no resources to start over elsewhere. Heaven's Gate members similarly pooled all their assets, and many had severed professional ties that would have provided income if they left. The Source family members contributed all earnings from their various enterprises to the collective, while Father Yod maintained personal luxury, creating a system where leaving meant financial ruin for ordinary members. Perhaps most insidiously, all three groups employed what psychologists call loaded language, specialized terminology that reinforced group identity while making communication with outsiders increasingly difficult. The Branch Davidians developed their own interpretations of biblical terms and concepts that only made sense within Koresh's theological framework. Heaven's Gate created an entire vocabulary around their beliefs about the next level, containers, and vehicles that isolated members from conventional ways of thinking about life and death. The Source family adopted new names and specialized terminology related to their Age of Aquarius beliefs that mark them as different from mainstream society. The manipulation of basic human needs for love, belonging, and purpose proved particularly effective. All three leaders presented themselves as offering something unavailable in the outside world, whether it was salvation through biblical prophecy, evolution to a higher plane of existence, or enlightenment through spiritual practice. They exploited members' genuine spiritual seeking and desire for community, gradually transforming these healthy impulses into unhealthy dependence. Sexual control emerged as a common theme, though manifested differently in each group. Koresh claimed divine authority to take multiple wives while demanding celibacy from other men, using sexuality as both reward and punishment to maintain control. Heaven's Gate demanded complete sexual abstinence and even encouraged castration, using the suppression of natural desires to increase psychological dependence on the group. The Source family promoted free love under Father Yod's guidance, but this freedom was actually another form of control, as sexual relationships were subject to his approval and manipulation. The gradual escalation of commitment proved crucial in all three cases. None of these groups immediately demanded the ultimate sacrifice from new members. Instead, they used a process psychologists call foot in the door technique, starting with small commitments that gradually increased over time. New members might initially attend meetings or visit the community, then be encouraged to spend more time, contribute resources, move in temporarily, and eventually sever all outside ties. By the time members realized the full extent of what was expected, they had already invested so much that leaving seemed impossible. All three leaders also demonstrated remarkable skill at exploiting moments of crisis to strengthen their control. Koresh used the initial ATF raid to reinforce his teachings about government persecution, turning a law enforcement action into validation of his prophecies. Applewhite reframed Nettle's death from cancer as part of their spiritual journey, using personal tragedy to deepen members' commitment to the group's beliefs. Father Yod used various external pressures and challenges as opportunities to demand greater loyalty and sacrifice from his followers. The role of cognitive dissonance cannot be ignored in understanding how these groups maintained control. When reality conflicted with the group's teachings, members were trained to doubt their own perceptions rather than question the leadership. Failed prophecies, obvious contradictions, and harmful policies were rationalized through increasingly complex mental gymnastics that left members more confused and dependent than before. Particularly disturbing was how all three groups exploited their members' children. The Branch Davidians subjected children to Koresh's abusive authority and separated them from their parents' protection. Heaven's Gate, while having fewer children, still exposed young people to their destructive ideology. The Source family encouraged early marriages and childbearing within their controlled environment, using children as additional bonds to keep parents committed to the group. The tragic endings of the Branch Davidians and Heaven's Gate demonstrate how these psychological control mechanisms can lead to ultimate destruction. When external pressure mounted, the intense bonding and isolation that held these groups together became instruments of death rather than community. Members had been so thoroughly conditioned to trust their leaders and distrust the outside world that they chose death over the possibility of freedom. Even the Source family, which avoided mass casualties, demonstrates the lasting psychological damage these systems can inflict. Former members often struggled for years to rebuild their identities, relationships, and practical life skills after leaving. Many reported ongoing difficulties with decision-making, relationships, and trusting their own judgment, testament to how thoroughly their psychological autonomy had been compromised. These three cases reveal that the deadliest aspect of cults isn't always physical violence, but the systematic destruction of human agency and critical thinking that makes such violence possible. What makes these psychological manipulation tactics so devastatingly effective is how they exploit our most fundamental human needs. Think about it. Every single person on this planet craves belonging, purpose, and meaning. We're social creatures hardwired to seek connection and community. These cult leaders understood this better than most trained psychologists, and they weaponized these natural human desires with surgical precision. The recruitment process rarely began with extreme demands or bizarre beliefs. Instead, it started with love bombing, an overwhelming display of affection, attention, and acceptance that felt intoxicating to vulnerable individuals. Imagine being someone struggling with loneliness, depression, or life transitions, and suddenly encountering a group that makes you feel like the most important person in the world. David Koresh would spend hours personally mentoring new recruits, making them feel specially chosen. Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles presented themselves as caring guides who had unlocked the secrets of existence. Father Yod offered celebrities and lost souls alike a glamorous escape from mainstream society's pressures. This initial honeymoon phase created what psychologists call trauma bonding. The intense positive emotions associated with joining the group became neurologically linked to the leader and the community. Members would literally become addicted to the feeling of belonging, making it exponentially harder to leave even when warning signs emerged. The brain chemistry involved mirrors that of romantic infatuation or drug addiction, creating genuine psychological dependence that victims often couldn't recognize or control. The isolation tactics that followed were masterfully gradual. It didn't happen overnight. First, members might be encouraged to spend more time with the group, attending additional meetings or social events. Then came subtle suggestions about the spiritual dangers of outside influences. Family members and old friends were gradually reframed as obstacles to spiritual growth, sources of negative energy, or even agents of evil forces. The Branch Davidians were taught that the outside world was controlled by Satan and would try to corrupt their pure mission. Heaven's Gate members learned that their human attachments were chains preventing their evolution to the next level. Geographic isolation amplified these effects exponentially. When the Source family moved to their compound in Hawaii, members found themselves thousands of miles from their support networks, completely dependent on the group for survival. The Branch Davidians' remote Texas compound became a world unto itself, where David Koresh's word was literally law. Heaven's Gate members lived in rented houses, moving frequently, creating a nomadic existence that severed ties to any stable community outside the group. But perhaps the most insidious aspect was the systematic destruction of individual identity and critical thinking. This process, known as thought reform or brainwashing, involved overwhelming members with new information, complex ideologies, and constant activity that left no time for reflection or questioning. Sleep deprivation was common across all three groups, whether through marathon Bible study sessions with Koresh, meditation, and work schedules in the Source family, or the rigid routines of Heaven's Gate. The introduction of specialized language created an us versus them mentality, while making it harder for members to communicate their experiences to outsiders. Heaven's Gate members spoke of their bodies as vehicles and containers, their deaths as a graduation, and their leader as their older member. The Source family developed their own terminology around Aquarian consciousness and the age of Aquarius. Branch Davidians learned to see themselves as the chosen remnant, with Koresh as their divinely appointed leader and the outside world as Babylon. Economic dependence sealed the trap. Members turned over their assets, salaries, inheritances, and possessions to the group. This wasn't presented as exploitation, but as spiritual purification, a rejection of materialism, or preparation for the coming transformation. The Source family members worked in Father Yod's restaurant empire, generating income that supported his luxurious lifestyle while they lived communally. Heaven's Gate members pooled their resources and worked in the group's computer business. Branch Davidians contributed everything to their collective preparation for the end times. The sexual manipulation present in these groups reveals another layer of psychological control. David Koresh claimed divine authority to have multiple wives while demanding celibacy from other male members, creating a system where he alone could fulfill basic human needs for intimacy and reproduction. This wasn't just about sexual gratification, it was about power and control over the most private aspects of human experience. Father Yod similarly maintained multiple spiritual wives while preaching about free love, but within a structure that ultimately served his desires and authority. The progressive commitment techniques used by these leaders created a psychological phenomenon known as the escalation of commitment. Small initial requests gradually built to larger demands, with each step seeming reasonable given what members had already accepted. Someone who started by attending a few Bible studies with the Branch Davidians might eventually find themselves stockpiling weapons and preparing for armed conflict with federal agents. A person drawn to the Source family's healthy lifestyle and spiritual teachings might end up surrendering their children's education and welfare to Father Yod's unconventional child-rearing philosophies. What makes these stories even more tragic is how the leaders themselves seem to believe their own delusions, at least partially. David Koresh appeared genuinely convinced of his prophetic role, even as he used it to justify sexual abuse and authoritarian control. Marshall Applewhite's willingness to castrate himself and ultimately die alongside his followers suggests a level of commitment to his beliefs that went beyond mere manipulation. Father Yod's lifestyle and teachings, while self-serving, seemed rooted in genuine spiritual seeking, however misguided. The psychological profiles of cult members defy simple stereotypes. These weren't just weak-minded or gullible individuals. Many were intelligent, educated, and successful people who joined during vulnerable periods in their lives. The Source family attracted Hollywood celebrities, artists, and entrepreneurs. Heaven's Gate included former military personnel, computer programmers, and college graduates. The Branch Davidians drew from various backgrounds, including people with advanced degrees and professional careers. Understanding these manipulation tactics is crucial because they reveal how anyone can become vulnerable under the right circumstances. The techniques used by these cult leaders appear in various forms throughout society, from abusive relationships to extremist political movements to predatory business schemes. The same psychological principles that trapped people in these deadly cults operate in many contexts where power is abused and individuals are exploited. The aftermath for survivors reveals the long-term psychological damage inflicted by these groups. Former members often struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, difficulty trusting their own judgment, problems forming healthy relationships, and what psychologists call complex trauma. Many report feeling like they lost years or decades of their lives, missing crucial developmental periods, educational opportunities, or career advancement. What makes these three cults so terrifying isn't just their tragic endings, but how they reveal the dark blueprint that countless other dangerous groups have followed since. The techniques we've examined, the psychological manipulation, the gradual erosion of individual identity, the exploitation of our deepest human needs, these aren't relics of the past. They're happening right now, in communities across the world, often hiding behind the same promises of belonging, purpose, and transcendence that initially drew people to Waco, Heaven's Gate, and the Source family. The most chilling aspect of studying these groups is recognizing how ordinary their beginnings were. The Branch Davidians started as people seeking deeper religious meaning. Heaven's Gate attracted individuals looking for answers about life's purpose and humanity's place in the universe. The Source family drew those yearning for community, health, and spiritual growth during a time of social upheaval. These weren't inherently evil people joining obviously dangerous organizations. They were human beings with legitimate needs and desires who encountered charismatic leaders willing to exploit those vulnerabilities for personal gain. Understanding the progression from idealism to tragedy reveals a disturbing pattern. Each group began with seemingly noble goals. The Branch Davidians emphasized biblical study and preparation for Christ's return. Heaven's Gate promoted spiritual evolution and transcendence of human limitations. The Source family advocated for natural living, artistic expression, and communal harmony. Yet in every case, these positive foundations became twisted into instruments of control, manipulation, and ultimately destruction. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It occurred through a gradual process that researchers now recognize as systematic psychological conditioning. First came the love bombing, the overwhelming sense of acceptance and belonging that made new members feel special and chosen. Then came the gradual isolation from outside influences, friends, family, and independent sources of information. As members became more dependent on the group for their social, emotional, and often financial needs, the leader's demands became increasingly extreme. Critical thinking was systematically dismantled through sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, constant indoctrination, and the suppression of doubt or questioning. Members were taught that their previous identities were false, that only through complete submission to the leader could they achieve their spiritual goals. By the time the most dangerous demands were made, whether stockpiling weapons, preparing for mass suicide, or accepting sexual exploitation, members had already surrendered their ability to think independently. The role of the leader in each case was crucial, and the similarities between David Koresh, Marshall Applewhite, and Father Yod are striking. All three presented themselves as divinely inspired figures with special knowledge or abilities. They demanded absolute loyalty while living by different rules than their followers. They used sex as a tool of control, whether through Koresh's spiritual wives, Applewhite's enforced celibacy, or Father Yod's multiple marriages within the family. They isolated their groups from mainstream society, creating alternate realities where their word was law and outside perspectives were dismissed as persecution or ignorance. Perhaps most disturbing is how these leaders seem to believe their own propaganda. Koresh appeared genuinely convinced he was the prophesied Lamb of Revelation. Applewhite truly seemed to believe he was leading his followers to a higher evolutionary level. Father Yod acted as though he was ushering in a new age of consciousness. This self-deception made them even more dangerous because their conviction was genuine, making their manipulation more persuasive and their demands more extreme. The psychological impact on survivors and families has been profound and lasting. Those who escaped these groups often struggled with guilt, shame, and difficulty trusting their own judgment. Many required years of therapy to recover their sense of self and ability to form healthy relationships. The families of those who died in Waco or with Heaven's Gate faced not only grief, but also the stigma and misunderstanding of a society that often blamed the victims for their involvement. These cases also highlight the complex relationship between religious freedom and public safety. In each situation, authorities faced the difficult question of when to intervene in the activities of religious groups. The tragic outcome at Waco demonstrated the dangers of aggressive law enforcement action, while the Heaven's Gate suicides showed what could happen when warning signs were ignored. The Source family's relatively peaceful dissolution after Father Yod's accidental death illustrates how the removal of a charismatic leader often leads to the natural collapse of such groups. The legacy of these three cults extends far beyond their immediate victims. They've influenced how law enforcement approaches similar situations, how mental health professionals understand cult psychology, and how families recognize warning signs of dangerous group involvement. Their stories serve as cautionary tales about the vulnerability of human psychology and the responsibility we all bear to protect those who might be susceptible to such manipulation. Today, as we face new forms of extremism and online radicalization, the lessons from these historical cases remain critically relevant. The internet has created new opportunities for charismatic leaders to reach vulnerable individuals, often using the same techniques of love bombing, isolation, and gradual indoctrination that proved so effective in the pre-digital age. Understanding how the Branch Davidians, Heaven's Gate, and the Source family operated provides essential insight into recognizing and preventing similar tragedies in our modern world. The ultimate tragedy of these groups lies not in their bizarre beliefs or dramatic endings, but in the waste of human potential they represent. The individuals who died at Waco, in Rancho Santa Fe, or who suffered psychological damage in the Source family were people with hopes, dreams, talents, and contributions to make to the world. Their stories remind us that behind every cult statistic is a human being whose life was cut short or fundamentally damaged by the selfish ambitions of those who claim to love them while exploiting their deepest needs and fears.